Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Diana Nunez. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad that you signed off. So I signed on. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me. For those of you on the call who are unfamiliar with the work of Oregon Environmental Council, we are an independent nonprofit organization that has worked since 1968 to create a healthier environment in this state that we treasure. Our early legacy included the state bottle bill, curbside recycling, and statewide land use planning programs. Our work has always focused on the most critical issues, protecting our water resources, from protecting our kids from toxic pollution, and especially protecting our climate. Thank you to the many donors, elected officials, agency staff, and colleagues on this call who have supported us in that work. It's been a tough and chaotic year in so many ways. COVID, wildfires, Black Lives Matter movement, but also an opportunity to learn and adapt in ways that can make us more resilient in the future. Whether it's climate change, a pandemic, social justice, or the long anticipated big quake off of our coast. Ultimately, this event is a message of hope. Our featured speaker, Steve Brown, will talk to you about how in these trying times, technological innovation is making our world not only more resilient, but also more sustainable. Our three-person panel will add their perspectives as climate social justice and emergency preparedness experts, including the challenges of implementing new technologies and what is needed to ensure that we serve all the needs of all Oregonians. We'll then reserve the second half hour. We'll reserve the half an hour at the end for your questions and answers from the participants. A little bit of housekeeping first. The event is being recorded and will be available afterwards on Zoom until December 15th. All audience members are on mute, but we will encourage you to use the Q&A button below on your screen to submit questions. To minimize distractions for our speakers, you won't see any of the questions on the screen, but rest assured, we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can after the presentations are over. And this is the final event in our 24th year of our Forum of Business and Environment Speaker Series. We were able to make this event free thanks to the generous support of more than 20 sponsors who were listed on the event invitations and on our initial slide that we presented. We'd particularly like to thank Columbia Bank and Lyft for their leadership level sponsorships. Now for our featured speaker. Today is Portland's own Steve Brown. Steve Brown is a futurist, author, entrepreneur, and advisor with over 30 years of experience in high tech. Prior to building his own consulting business, he was Intel's chief evangelist and worked in Intel Labs as a futurist, where he imagined and built plans for a world of 5, 10, and 15 years into the future. After leaving Intel in 2016, Steve built his own company, Possibility and Purpose LLC, and has consulted with and trained businesses, agencies, and nonprofits from Fortune 500 companies like Nike and Disney to Oregon-focused organizations, including PGE, the Oregon Lottery, Asante, and the Oregon Symphony. He recently published The Innovation Ultimatum to share his knowledge and insights to an even broader audience. We're delighted to have him as our keynote speaker to start today's conversation. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Diana, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on this foggy day in Oregon. As I look out of my window here, it reminds me of a couple of months ago when we were sat in revolting smoke, and we really start to appreciate just how important our environment is to us. So thank you to the Oregon Environmental Council for inviting me today, and to the sponsors for helping to make all of this possible. It's been a crappy year. There's no two ways about it. And so what I wanted to bring you today was something a bit more optimistic, a bit more hopeful about where we might go next. Technology has caused some of the problems that we have, let's say. The Industrial Revolution and everything that followed it has led to wide-scale destruction of our environment. That's not a good thing. But I think the same technology that has caused a lot of the problems, but helped us live productive, healthy lives, live much longer now than we did pre-industrial revolution. Some of that technology we can turn around now and start to use to help mitigate the environmental problems that technology has wrought upon us. So, what am I going to share with you today? Before I get into that, just a quick disclaimer on what a futurist is. Many of you may have heard me speak before. For those of you who haven't or are not quite sure what a futurist is, I don't sit in a darkened room with my crystal ball and think big thoughts. And I don't make predictions about the future. That is a fortune teller. The discipline of a futurist is to look at how trends come together, technology trends, business trends, environmental trends, people trends, and then figure out, as those trends come together over time, what will be possible in a certain time frame? What is the possibility landscape? And then once you understand that landscape of possibility, to determine a plan to move forward. And in my world, that means I'm helping build a digital innovation plan. So I'm going to give you a tool on how you might think about that later on, but that's what a futurist does. That's certainly what I do. So today, what I've got for you is 3 pieces of this presentation. First of all, the team asked me to run you through 3 ways, 3 lenses of thinking about this time, this difficult time of COVID, which I hope will allow you to find opportunity and to find the silver lining in this difficult time. Secondly, very quickly to talk about this innovation framework I have. The reason I want to do that is it sets up the rest of the presentation and gives you sort of a background for how these technologies might come together to help us solve environmental problems. And that's where I think the third section is environmental opportunity. We'll spend most of our time in that area. So let's dive in. 3 lenses, 3 ways of thinking about this current time that we're in. COVID feels like, we were all sent to our bedrooms to think about what we'd done, right? We've had time to reflect. And I think about this time as the great reflection. We have been forced to face the notion that the world that we live in is very fragile. The society, even our individual lives turned out to be way more fragile than perhaps any of us realized. And so that time of reflection has made us reconsider our values, what our purpose is in the world, what is important to us, what our priorities are. Perhaps it's family, looking after kids. Perhaps it is maybe doing something better in terms of the impact that we have on society and the planet. But this has been the great reflection. I think we're all in that very reflective mode and still are. The second thing I think this has done is to defrost organizations. What I mean by that is that many organizations, even industries, are frozen in place largely because of either tradition, because of regulation, think healthcare, or because they're just risk averse, or maybe they're just complacent about the way that they operate. And COVID has forced people to break that apart. It has defrosted organizations, industries, our society, and enabled rapid change. Think about the change that has come into the world of education, for example, or in the healthcare industry. Telehealth has increased from about 50,000 telehealth visits in 2019 to close to 1 billion in the USA alone, 1 billion telehealth visits this year. So dramatic change, and that's never going to go back. So it is defrosted. This means that change agents are emboldened, and it means that we get to decide now how things will refreeze, what shape the world will refreeze into once this time has passed. So let's use this difficult time to drive much needed change. The third lens I would offer for thinking about this time is it is the great acceleration. I wrote this book you see over my shoulder. I wrote that last year, and it was published on February the 5th of this year. So right as COVID was hitting our shores. And a lot of people have asked me, well, has it changed anything? The answer is yes. Everything I talk about in my book, I think absolutely still is on track. The difference is it's all going to happen much, much sooner. The timeline of this book was 10 years. I think we're more likely looking at 5 to 7 years, and in some cases, 2 to 3 years for some of the things that I have listed in that book. The reason is that businesses en masse certainly have been coming to me and saying, Steve, my 5-year business plan for 2025, how do I make it happen next year? Can you help me think that through? So there's a wide appetite for increases in automation because robots don't get sick and delivery trucks don't carry disease if there's no humans in them. And just to innovate, to compete, to become more digital, to to embrace digital ways of doing things, both for customers, to give the customers a 100% digital journey, and for employees, to give them a way of participating wherever they are. And so you see the rise of the remote employee coming out of this. So that's 3 lenses. I know I hit that fast, but I've got lots of other stuff I want to get to. Reflection, defrosting, acceleration. Those 3 things together present opportunity for people who are in the business of driving change. And I'm guessing that if you're on this call, if you're listening into this video, or if it's replaying afterwards, it's because you're interested in driving change. Use this time and use it well. Second thing I'll offer you today is this notion of an innovation framework, a way of thinking about using technology to drive much needed innovation. This is a framework I developed earlier this year. It's proven to be very useful as a way of thinking about how to drive change. Now, the big picture, before I get into what that innovation framework looks like, this is a story of the last 30 or 40 years, is that the digital world and the physical world are being combined in ever more intimate ways. And we're building bridges between those two. Now, let's step back a little bit. If you look at this black box on the screen, represents all business problems. Let's say all problems that humans need to solve. Some early technologies, early computing technologies, the PC and the web, so think what happened to us in the 90s and early 2000s, they enabled us to solve a bunch of business problems, a bunch of problems. It wasn't until 2007 when the iPhone was launched and we got cloud computing that we could solve a bunch more problems. We got location-based services like Lyft. We got essentially a remote control for the modern world in our pockets and purses that we carried around with us everywhere we went. Computing got a lot more personal. And cloud computing was a way of standing up infrastructure without having to pay for it. You could lease the computing power you needed. That enabled innovation to happen very rapidly because startups had easy access to computing on demand as they were building new capabilities. So mobile and cloud allowed us to solve a bunch more problems. We're now on the edge of what I would call the 3rd era of personal computing, which is the spatial computing era. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. This is a set of technologies that allow us to have really intimate connections between the physical and the digital world and enable us to solve a lot more problems than we could solve before. Many of those problems I'm going to talk about today in an environmental context. So what are those technologies? Well, it's the Internet of Things and sensors. This is the idea of putting tiny computers and sensors into everything in the world, into objects, infrastructure, into buildings, and so on. Autonomous machines, that's everything from robots and drones to autonomous cars, trucks, planes, ships, all of it. Satellite and 5G networks, you've got to connect all of this stuff together. We'll talk about those networks shortly. Augmented reality is the technology that if you think about virtual reality, this is when you put on a headset and you're completely immersed in a new world. You look around, you feel like you're somewhere else. That's great, but it disconnects you from the world around you. Augmented reality, imagine a headset where you can still see the world around you, but overlaid on top of that, digital information, objects in the space around you that blend together. That's a real breakthrough. Artificial intelligence, which we're all sick of hearing about because it's on the news like every day. The reason for that is it's incredibly powerful technology that enables us to solve problems in a whole new way. And that is also building these connections because it's enabling machines to see, hear, and understand the world, and for them to understand us when we speak to them for the first time. And then finally, blockchain technology. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's kind of esoteric, but this is a technology that enables us to have trustless transactions and to programmatically build businesses. And I'll explain a little bit about that later. All right, so those are the spatial computing technologies. Between them, they are going to help us build this bridge, very intimate bridge between the physical and the digital worlds, giving us the ability to have much more impact on the physical world that we live in. And that's the key here. So I talked about an innovation framework. This is the framework that I've built. Down the left-hand side of this screen, you will see the 5 main things that businesses or organizations try and do. They want to create new offerings, new products, services, and experiences. They want to get those products, services, experiences to new customers in new markets through new channels. They want to make it better for their workers, to enhance their worker experience, to help their workers do more and to be more creative, to make better decisions, and so on. They want to streamline their operations and their business processes. And finally, they're looking to create new revenue streams and business models. Now, in an environmental context, how many of these apply? Well, turns out a few. And at the intersection of each of these technologies that I talked about, the 6 spatial computing technologies, with those 5 business imperatives, you see an opportunity. So these intersections of these opportunities that I want to talk about today. And I'm going to dig into a number of these, and then we'll come back at the end and see how far we got on this matrix. So that's the framework I want to give you. Let's dive in with the intersection of satellite and 5G networks with enhanced worker experience, because this has environmental implications. It's led to this notion of the anywhere worker, people who can work anywhere on the planet. That's happening anyway because we have wired connections already. But what if you want to go and work in a rural area? Or if you're already working in a rural area and you want to tap into a high-paying job at Facebook? Well, soon you'll be able to do that, because the companies you see listed on the left-hand side of the screen here, they are all putting low Earth orbit satellites up. Thousands of them will put more satellites into orbit in the next 5 years than all of human history prior to today. And those satellites will work in a network to blanket the Earth with high-speed internet connectivity, making it possible to connect everyone and everything everywhere before the end of the decade. And in some locations, maybe within 3 or 4 or 5 years. Early trials are already in place with lots of these. What does this mean? What it means is that companies will be able to attract talent, not just from the area where people are willing to drive into the office from around where they are located, maybe 30, 40 miles, maybe it's an hour commute, whatever people's tolerance might be. Now they can attract talent from around the world because they can work from anywhere. It also means that wealth from those companies can be projected into those local communities and spent in those local communities. So if you have a beautiful rural environment, maybe now you have someone that works for Cisco or works for Apple that is now able to spend their Apple money in your local grocery shop. The other thing that this has is implications for the environment. Vastly reduced commute times, because people are no longer having to drive into the office. They're working remote more. The office is not dead, but the default will change. The default used to be you went into the office as a default and you stayed home by exception. That may now flip going forward, at least for some types of work. It also, if we have less commute, that means lower emissions. And I did some research ahead of this on what COVID had done, and COVID has accelerated this trend of work from home. That will not go back to the way we were before in 2019. We'll certainly have more people go back to the office when this is all done, but it has set a new bar. And in the first half of this year, it's estimated that because of COVID, we saved 62 million commute hours per day in the USA alone. And that reduced emissions in the first half of 2020 over the first half of 2019 by 8.8% globally. So if we can figure out ways for more people to work remote, this is going to be good for our impact on the planet. So that takes us into, okay, that's one example. What are the other things you've got, Mr. Future Boy, to help me understand how technology might be used to at least mitigate some of the environmental challenges that we face? Now, there's a ton of stuff I could have brought you today. I picked a small sampling to help you understand how some of these technologies could play a positive role for us in the future. Let's first of all talk about energy. At the grid level scale, lots of talk about smart grids, intelligently managing supply and demand over the duck curve of the day. Duck curve, that if you're not familiar with the duck curve, it turns out that the demand curve for energy through the day looks somewhat like a duck. It's just the way it is. one of the challenges of really turning lots of renewable energy is to manage the duck and to be able to store enough energy when people are generally not using a full amount, and then to be able to release that when people need it, when they get home from work and want a cup of tea or whatever it might be. I'm sounding very British there. So you have to be able to store energy, and there's lots of ways you can try and do that. Lots of people working on things. I brought you a fun one today, which is a gigantic robot the size of a skyscraper. And what they're doing here is storing energy kinetically. So when there's energy to spare, coming from those hydroelectric dams, you pick up these blocks and you store them on the tower. When you need to release the energy, you just drop them, and that turns a generator that creates energy that you push back into the grid. So this is the type of thinking that we need to develop in order to make sure that we can move more towards renewables, so that when the sun don't shine or the wind don't blow, we still have power stored up. If you get smaller, so that's a sort of a grid level approach to storing energy, which is probably the biggest challenge that we have out there. If you start looking at the local level, there are already people who are putting solar panels on their roofs, not so much here in Oregon, because looking out the window, there's not much sun here today. But certainly in the southern states, this is a very viable approach. And there are smart inverters that can take that power, give it to your household appliances when you need it, push it to a battery when you don't, and even push energy back to the grid, so you can start to sell energy to the utility company when you don't need it. Those are starting to get even smarter over time, as you start to see smart cars being used as batteries, having capabilities to be able to be charged when you are not driving the car, it's just parked in the garage, using it as energy storage, and then pushing some of that energy back into the house when you need it, so that you can power your dishwasher or whatever it might be. Obviously, you make sure you still have enough to be able to drive to work the next day. But this is intelligently using these resources. There's also a lot of movement in being able to sell energy locally. So if you're not using energy, but your neighbor is, then you can sell them energy in a small microgrid. There's lots of prototype efforts going on in this realm, and there are a lot of companies working in this area. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the names of a number of companies. They're using blockchain technology to be able to manage those transactions, to sell energy back and forth, to move it into the car, buying it from the grid, buying it from a neighbor, storing it in a battery, maybe using it from a neighbor, selling to a neighbor. There are even intelligence built into it, so that you might store your energy that's coming from your solar panels in your battery right now, and then sell it back to the grid later in the day when the energy price is higher. So lots of transactive energy efforts going on, and all predicated on this blockchain technology. Now, we all need to figure out ways to use less energy. And one of the great ways to change human behavior is to give them a feedback loop and to gamify something. If any of you have driven a Prius, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because there's that display that shows your consumption. As soon as you turn that on, guess what? Your driving habits change. You pull back on the gas pedal because you're trying to beat the system and get as much miles per gallon as you possibly can. Similar things can be delivered for the home. And there are a number of companies. Neurio is one. Sense is another. They make these little bricks that you plug into the junction box in your home, and it monitors the usage of in the house. And it uses a little bit of artificial intelligence to look at the signal spikes of the demand of your appliances, and it can identify, well, that's a washing machine going on. That's the electric shower. That's the toaster. And be able to give you a breakdown of what all that information looks like. So you can see how much energy am I using on my freezer, how much energy am I using on my microwave, and so on, and maybe start to change your habits over time. This is also similar dashboards being created for businesses, so they can start to look at where their energy goes and maybe start to work with their employees to limit the amount of energy they're using. Maybe they didn't realize they're spending that much energy on lighting. Perhaps if they installed LEDs or some other different lighting system or a lighting timer or regimen, they could save a bunch of energy. Let's talk about transportation. Transportation takes up 16% of global carbon emissions come from transportation. This is a big deal if we can start to decarbonify. Is that a word? should be, transportation. So there's a couple of things going on here. The first one is cars are becoming autonomous. We've all heard about self-driving cars. And every car company is in a race to get this done. Out in front are Waymo, former Google company, and bizarrely, GM is doing really well. As cars go autonomous, the reason that's important from an environmental standpoint is cars can then be shared much more than they are today. You get a lot more fleet cars. And how many of these autonomous cars are coming? You're going to start seeing them showing up very soon. But really, it's not until about 2030 that the economics, where the price of a self-driving car and a dumb car are so close that why would you ever buy a dumb car again? And then suddenly you see that come in. The gray area on this chart shows full autonomous, level 4 and level 5 autonomy. So by 2040, most of the cars out there will be able to drive themselves. And we can do other things while we're traveling around. Great, we can watch Netflix as we go from A to B. Or do other things, whatever it might be. So more use of our time as we're moving. But this is what the interesting part for me from an environmental standpoint is that we will, as a result of autonomy, see more units on the road that are fleet cars that are in constant use rather than spending most of their time parked, which 95% of the time cars are, 95% of a car's life is parked doing nothing, using that resource far more effectively. So as you can see on this chart here, the percentage of fleet units versus personal units is going to flip over. And that's largely as a result of going autonomous, way more efficient and effective. You drop off a passenger, you pick up another one, take them where they need to go. And that also means you might use the car in different ways. So here you see an image from Mercedes showing, hey, when you need the business car where on the journey, you need to be able to have a video conference as you move from one client to another. You can make that happen. If you can have self-driving cars, you can have self-driving trucks. Every truck company out there is working hard to make that a reality. And transportation is also going electric to take advantage of the shift of the transportation system over to electric. We're going to have a huge infrastructure investment to make sure you can charge the cars as you move around. And this is being driven by the car manufacturers who are responding to country regulations. On the right-hand side, you see the flags of all the countries that are taking leadership positions and saying, by this date, you cannot sell any car that is just gasoline or diesel. They have to be hybrid or electric. And then as you get into sort of the 2040 timeframe, you see laggards like Canada and France coming along, Spain. And then 2050, London is saying you will not be able to drive in the city of London unless your car is zero emissions. So I'm expecting that those standards the dial will get cranked up. You've already seen the UK, they were in that 2040 position. They're now saying by 2030, it will not be possible to sell a gasoline or diesel only car. And you'll see requirements for more zero emissions versus hybrids, I expect. And you see on the left-hand side here, the car manufacturers are responding. And they're planning lots of new models that are either electric only or hybrid electric. In London, they already have a congestion zone where you have to pay to go into this zone in London if you don't live there. The car on the bottom right there is a hybrid electric from BMW. It is automatically able, as it drives into that congestion zone, to turn off the petrol engine part of the car completely and only run on electric as it moves around inside a congestion zone. Zero emission cars do not have to pay the congestion charge, which is like $25 for the day to move around inside London. So there's going to be some interesting economic models there where governments use these types of congestion zones to drive change. It's not just happening in London, this is happening in many European cities. It'll be interesting to see when that comes to the States. And when you think about the electrification, you can see that by 2040, vast majority of cars on the road are projected to be electric. So we are on our way. It's not just cars that are going electric, it's also trucks. You see here, this is the Tesla Semi. It can do 500 miles on a single charge. It can recharge to a 400-mile range within only 30 minutes. And it has a mean time between failures of 1 million hours because it has so few moving parts, far more reliable than an existing truck. And they estimate that it will save 20 cents per mile over a diesel truck. So lots of orders have been placed for these. They're due to come out next year. Let's see if they really perform the way that Elon claims. This is the world's first electric ship. It is in China. It's been going to the water here. The irony here is that, guess what this is used to transport? Coal. Yep, that's true. I looked it up twice just to confirm because it seems so mad. But yeah, this is the world's first electric ship. And this is the world's first all-electric and autonomous ship. So this is the way I think that shipping goes in the future, crewless and electric. And this is in Norway. It will be used to replace, I think it's going to take 40,000 trucks per year off the road as it moves up and down in Norway, transporting containers back and forth. There are even efforts now to create hybrid and electric planes. The same way that we couldn't do electric cars right off the bat, we had to do hybrid first with the Prius-like approach, but now we can go all electric. Think your Teslas. The aircraft industry is having to do the same. So this is a hybrid plane from Boeing. It has wings that fold up, so it can actually land and then fold its wings up so it can come and use the same gates. It has very, very big wingspan, but it can use the same gate infrastructure that exists today. And they claim that it will be able to use 70% less fuel than a traditional plane. That's not coming on stream for at least 20 years though. This is another effort by Boeing called the Zunum Aero, partnership with JetBlue, little commuter planes, again, electric hybrid. This is another hybrid from Airbus in partnership with Siemens and Rolls-Royce. And Wright Electric is working in partnership with EasyJet, who does a lot of low-cost, short hop flights in Europe. They're hoping to have this in production within 10 years. It is an all-electric plane that they're hoping will move people up to 350 miles. So short hop, but could be a massive breakthrough if they can pull it off. There are even people coming up with some crazy ideas to use this approach. So to shoot the plane into the air with a shuttle that is powered on the runway, and then to switch the plane over, because that's where most of the jet fuel goes, is getting the damn thing off the ground. So if you can shoot it with the shuttle on the ground, this is an approach they're experimenting with. Maybe it'll come into production 25 to 30 years from now. Maybe it'll never happen. But people getting really creative, using technology to rethink the way that we move people around the planet. This is another creative way of moving people around. If you think about the drones that people have with cameras on them, scale it up so you can put people in it or cargo in it. There are over 100 companies building these passenger drones, fully electric, vertical takeoff and landing, many of them autonomously controlled as well, so you don't need to have a pilot's license for them. You can see the names of the companies involved here. Some of them are big names, some of them are big startups. Behind those startups, there's money from some of the major car companies. Uber is also involved in this area with their Uber Air program. They have said that they hope that long term, they will be able to get the cost per passenger mile down to the same level that road transportation is today. So this is not going to be an elite thing for the rich. This will be another transport mode to get people maybe to the airport quickly through busy traffic. If you scale those drones down, you can start to create environmentally friendly robots and drones. This is a Seattle company called Drone Seed. They are using drones with essentially a paintball gun on them to fire pellets into the ground to reforest areas. So after a forest fire or after clear cutting land, because this, we live in a logging state here, to be able to reforest quickly and efficiently, particularly on very steep hillside. They say that a tree planter working with a swarm of these drones working together, semi-autonomously controlled, they can plant 80 times as many trees in a day as they can without the help of the drones. want to share this robot really quickly. It's from a company called Eco Robotics in Sweden, Switzerland. This robot kills weeds. And you think, well, why does that help with the environment? Because it kills those weeds either with a mechanical rotation device and just zaps them, because it can see them. It roams through the fields. It's solar powered, roams through the fields. It can see the difference between a plant and a weed and zaps the weed. It zaps it mechanically, or it sprays a tiny bit of herbicide directly onto the weed. That is a completely different approach than just spraying herbicide on the field willy-nilly. Uses 90% less herbicide than just spraying the field without use of the robot. So it enables you to completely rethink the way that we use herbicides and other chemicals to control weeds. And it's a lot less cost for the farmer, but a lot less herbicide leaching into the groundwater. This is a drone that's being used in partnership with a company called EdgyBees, very weird name. They use augmented reality to overlay information to help emergency response teams. So whether it is a flood, a fire, other disaster, overlaying information to enable first responders to be able to act on that information. I'm going to show you a short video, which I have a feeling I didn't set things so that you'll get audio on this.
First response from EdgyBees enhances the capabilities that we already have from drones. So if you were looking to try to figure out what streets to route an engine or a brush truck in or something like that, that's available to you from the air rather than having to try to decipher it, what you're seeing in the visual onto a map. It just adds the information right on top of it, and you can make decisions quicker and better. First response.
Oh. How do we? Oh, there we go. All right, we're close to time, so let me go quickly for the rest of this talk. I wanted to just try and bring you stuff that would blow your minds a little bit. So this is a proposed vehicle from Hyundai called the Elevate. And again, I'm going to show you a video and explain to you what this is doing. It's using advanced sensing, robotics, and a little bit of artificial intelligence to be able to navigate over rough terrain, difficult terrain. So imagine this vehicle being used in earthquake response. So once the Cascadia earthquake levels Portland, being able to use a fleet of these vehicles to get to people, to rush people to medical care and so on. And they're already imagining how these vehicles might look and how they might build them. Generative design, while we're on the earthquake field, generative design is a technique that uses AI to rethink design and architecture. So it's a tool for designers to use. Instead of developing one design, the AI takes the initial design that the designer has created or the architect has created, and then riffs on it and creates hundreds or thousands of variants, which it then puts through simulation and comes back to the designer and says, hey, if you tweaked it this way, or you designed it that way, it would be 20% stronger or 5% lighter or cost 15 cents less to make. And you can see examples here of where generative design has been used to create these very sort of organic looking designs that are much better than the ones that were developed by the designer on their own. So this is a collaboration of AI and human working together. And you can use it in all sorts of places. This is an example where different office layouts to optimize the use of space in a building is being used. You can use it to optimize airflow in a building. This is a structure that was created in Seville, in Spain. It's designed to bring shade to the public areas in central Seville. It's one of the world's biggest wooden structures, and they used AI to help optimize the structure, not only for its shape and kind of cool looks, but it allows light to pass through while also providing shade. It is aerated to allow heat to rise through it, so that in the hottest months of the year, you're providing the most cooling without cutting out the light. So very complex design and optimization that AI helped to help the architect to find the very best solution. You can use this similar approach of taking a design and then tweaking it and testing it and finding the best way. It's almost like an evolutionary approach to improve the earthquake proofness of buildings. And you see here examples of where generative design is being used to look at the sort of the outer skin of a tower block and figure out the most seismically smart design. And it uses the same principle as like a double-edged cell. So a cell has two surfaces to it, which give it rigidity. Same approach is being used here, and it's being optimized for seismic characteristics. Final thing I want to share with you is talking about supply chains, which is a deathly boring topic, but it turns out that it's really important because supply chains are what make the world go round, and they're also what does the most damage on the planet. Because if you look at all of the issues that, if you're on this call, you're watching this video, we all care about passionately: climate change, unsustainable practices, deforestation, pollution, child and forced labor. What links them all together? Well, us. Our choices, our behaviors, the things that we buy, where they come from, how far they travel, how much energy we throw into the atmosphere as things move to us. Who makes the things that we buy? And we're kind of blissfully ignorant about that. And it's time for that to end. So we need smart supply chains that help to expose that information. Because today, we all have different priorities. Consumers want a good price. They want the product delivered to their house. They take the claims that the brands make to them through advertising, or they read the labels, and they make a purchase as best they can. The brands, in turn, they don't tend to make their own stuff. They go to their suppliers. They give them a bunch of requirements of what they want. Hey, don't use child labor. I won't look too closely. And then the suppliers make claims, hey, we don't use child labor. We're very environmentally sound. And people don't have to look too closely. The challenge is to bring transparency to this process so that we can align everybody's interests. And instead of people making claims, you start to bring proof and evidence to the whole process. There's a way of doing that with sensors, with artificial intelligence, with blockchain technology, to align all those priorities, to empower consumers with insights into what they're buying so they can make informed decisions. And I think to empower brands as well, to give them control over the suppliers so they're not caught. They're reducing their risk of being caught with child labor or using palm oil that's come from a bad plantation in Malaysia or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of work happening in this area. It makes me very optimistic if we can get our arms around this one. And the promise here, back last year in August, the Business Roundtable, they declared, to their credit, that they wanted to move the purpose of a corporation from being to make money for shareholders to be to serve all of the people involved, all of the stakeholders, their customers, their employees, their suppliers, the communities in which they operate, and yes, shareholders too. To realize that vision, we're going to need this kind of a smart supply chain, a digital supply chain that makes sure we balance the needs of all of the people involved in supplying us with the things that we need and use every day. Phew, we made it. So we went on a little journey there. I gave you lots of examples, from generative design to prosumer energy trading to fancy new robots, whether it's a giant skyscraper size one or a self-driving car that will hopefully get more cars off the road because we can share them. So there are opportunities throughout this matrix. I gave you a little glimpse of them today. If you want to know more about this, or if you found that tool useful, you can go to my website, baldfuturist.com. I'll show you the URL in a moment. You can download that. It's a PDF you can use just to help you think through that innovation. You can also get my book available in all good bookstores, especially including Powell's here. You can also get it on Amazon.com, of course, if you're feeling lazy. And that's how you can find me. If this was useful to you, if you want to have a conversation with me about how technology can help improve our environment, I'd be glad to have it with you. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it back over to you, Dana, and I look forward to all of your questions. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Steve. Lots to think about there. A number of examples. So if there are any questions, please remind everybody to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom, and we'll get to those shortly. But I would like to introduce Joanna Papanefthymiou. Since 2013, she's been the Planning, Policy, and Community Programs Manager at the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. She is responsible for the city's emergency response and recovery planning and also supervises the city's community outreach and volunteer programs. She is also the lead for resilience policy work, including energy, fuels, and infrastructure. She's previously worked as a political policy advisor, land use planner, and community organizer. She holds a bachelor's in writing and a master's in city planning. Please welcome Jana.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here. And Steve's given us a lot of interesting things to think about. I'm afraid, as is so often my role, I'm now going to bring you the disaster bring you the downside. But I do think that in a lot of ways, our work is also very related, and I hope we'll circle back to that in our conversation. But to start, I am going to try and share my screen with you. Right there. Let's see. That'll go. Yeah, I am screen sharing. Now let's see if I can make it a little bigger. Does that work? Slideshow. Yeah, there we go. Great. So we at the Bureau of Emergency Management take an all hazards approach. So we're very concerned with all the disasters that can impact Portland and definitely more than we hoped or expected this year with the pandemic and also wildland fires, some hot days this summer, terrible air quality. And now we're heading into winter, and my next meeting after this is to talk about winter sheltering and long-range forecasts for a very snowy January. So we take an all hazards approach, but particularly I was asked to tell you a bit about our preparation for earthquake, and that's always a rich topic for us because, as I expect most of you know, we have a profound earthquake risk here in the Pacific Northwest. The Cascadia subduction zone, or CSZ as we call it, off the coast of Oregon, means there's a 50 to 20% likelihood that we'll have a massive earthquake in the next 50 years. It would be up to about a magnitude 9 on the coast, and here in Portland, depending on what soils you're on and how wet they are at that time of year, could feel like a 6 to a 6.5. The thing that would be probably most remarkable about it is that a subduction zone earthquake is a very long-lasting earthquake. So if you have maybe experienced an earthquake in California or elsewhere, it probably lasted between 10 and 15 seconds, but an earthquake here would be 3 to 5 minutes. So that amount of shaking would have profound and devastating effect on our built environment. That's all I'm going to say about the likelihood of earthquakes, because we've also done some research at the Bureau to understand what people already know and why they're prepared. And in a statistically valid poll of Portlanders that we conducted about 2 years ago, we saw 74% of Portlanders already believe a disaster will occur in Portland in the next 10 years. So their future thinking actually even overestimates the likelihood probably of a catastrophic disaster. Yet the same research also tells us less than 50% of people are prepared in their homes for a disaster, and that tracks to national metrics of disaster preparedness. So people know that the future also holds some catastrophes. Why are they not more prepared? Well, we delved a little bit into that too, and one of the things we learned was that a lot of people feel like if things get really bad here, they're likely to seek to leave our region rather than stay and participate in recovery and rebuilding. And by really bad, I mean 2 weeks without electricity. And although 42% is a high number for leaving, that narrative sort of accords with the experience in other places, such as Puerto Rico, which, as you maybe remember, had a really big earthquake in 2017, Hurricane Maria, and did see a lot of out-migration because it impacted their power grid and they had not reliable power. Some places still, but for a year, much of the island had unreliable power. So we are not in quite the same shape as Puerto Rico, but we do know that it would take at best a month and probably more like 3 to 6 months to restore grid service in the Pacific Northwest after a catastrophic earthquake. So all those fantastic future innovations with universal internet and personal drones and whatnot, no power for a long time after an earthquake. A common strategy in disaster preparedness when we're out of power is to turn to diesel generators, and indeed hospitals and emergency centers like the place where I work have diesel backup. The bad news is that more than of Oregon's liquid fuel passes through one spot in Oregon that is not seismically strong. There are no refineries in Oregon, so 100% of our fuel is imported. A little bit comes on barges from Idaho, but the majority of it comes on the Olympic pipeline or on a barge from California and ends up in this neighborhood in Portland. The tanks there were built between about 1910 and most were completed before 1980. According to the City of Portland's records, building code, only three of them would probably survive a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, and the rest would be unusable. So we would be left with just the fuel in our tanks, in our gas tanks, in our backup generator on the day the earthquake happened, and with what's in gas stations. And most gas stations have a 2 or 3 day supply stored. Right. So we still promote household preparedness, and we have those diesel generators at our critical facilities. We're also seeking to retrofit our own critical infrastructure, as are energy companies and others. And those strategies are important and have a role. But we also see that by themselves, that thinking is probably would not be sufficient for the magnitude of the event that we can expect here. We also see that those traditional types of responses underserve the same communities that have been underserved in our country and our state and our city for a long time. Unfortunately, in earthquakes and hurricanes and snow events, just as we're seeing right now in COVID, communities of color, Black and Indigenous communities, people with disabilities, immigrants and refugees are consistently the ones that are impacted first and experience the most long-lasting effects of a disaster. And a lot of the technological innovations, like the ones that Steve were just talking about, they have a great promise of benefit for people who can access them, but the majority of people will still live in older buildings and are kind of stuck with the technology that we have right now. And that's why resilience strategies for the City of Portland and for our Bureau seek to, one, to really prioritize those communities that we know will be hit first, and two, to focus on neighborhood and community preparedness rather than the preparedness of individual households. There's one, we know that not every person can have all the things that they need to be disaster prepared, but that as a community, we can help each other. And that can position us better to be resilient. And I think two statistics that I like to cite and I think are relevant in that regard are, one, when we think about emergency response, like that immediate earthquake or flood response, 95% of people who are rescued after a disaster are actually dug out of the rubble or pulled out of the floodwaters. They're rescued by their neighbors or other bystanders. They're not rescued by professional responders because there will just never be enough firefighters to do the work that's necessary. So in the short term, the neighborhood emergency response is super important. But also, interestingly, in the long term, that similarly holds true because social cohesion is in many studies the greatest indicator of disaster resilience and recovery. And there's some great long-term studies of like tsunami recovery in Japan that show that communities that had high social cohesion, where neighbors know one another and were connected in a lot of different ways before that disaster, are also the communities that recovered most quickly. And then finally, a strategy for us, I think, has to be to build back better, because if we respond to a disaster simply by rebuilding a giant tank farm someplace slightly farther up the river or down the river, we're not positioning ourselves for the future or for the next disaster that comes down the road. So with respect to the city's natural hazard mitigation planning and how that relates to kind of the energy technologies that we had talked about, we're planning for solar and battery storage systems. Fire Station 1 downtown has one already, and I am this week developing a grant to do solar with battery backup at the East Portland Community Center. So if FEMA agrees that it's a good idea, I'm hopeful that they will, or we'll keep looking for other funding. We'll be developing that as a place that would be the first sort of community relief hub with the solar and battery system. So a place where you could have lights at night, have staging for emergency relief work, people could charge their phone, communicate with people outside the area after an earthquake to let them know that they're okay, but also that it could be kind of the heart of mutual aid efforts for people in East Portland to help one another, do community kitchens, and start to think about the long range resilience. We're encouraging solar and storage demonstration projects. A couple of our neighborhood emergency team volunteers are embarking on that with the idea not only that they'll be prepared in their household, but that they can be a hub for resilience in their own neighborhood. And long term, that's really our strategy, is to, in large part, is to promote and fund energy independent projects and other projects that help communities help themselves. There's more I could say, but I'm really interested to hear the other presenters, and I hope to leave time some conversation at the end. So I think I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. I really appreciate your expertise. Our next presenter, Ernesto Fonseca, joined Hacienda CDC as CEO in April of 2017, bringing his passion for community development and a belief in the power of connecting families to opportunity. He earned his PhD from Arizona State University in environmental design and planning. And during his time in Phoenix, he spearheaded initiatives to assess the health impacts of community development, including gentrification, access to public transportation, and affordable housing, and helped to create the Stardust Center for Affordable Homes and the Family. Please welcome Ernesto Fonseca.
Thank you, everyone. I cannot see my video yet, but I hope that the team can. Okay. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. All right, my name is Ernesto Fonseca. Like Diana said, I am the Chief Executive for Hacienda CDC. Although, you know, that has been only for the past 3 years and a half here in Portland. And before I go on with my presentation, I want to thank Steve, you know, for that wonderful vision of what the future might look like in terms of energy efficiency, energy creation, and cleaning the environment in so many other ways. And Jana for helping us understand, you know, what the city of Portland and in general, you know, the state of Oregon are ready to do in case of an emergency. I want to give you a quick overview of what Hacienda does, and I'm going to finish with a slide of one of our latest real estate development projects that is going to be breaking ground at the beginning of the year. And with that particular project, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the intersection between health, technology, and the future of housing in so many concerns. So let's share this presentation. And here we go. So Hacienda CDC, as Diana said, it's a Latino-led organization that is serving communities through housing, economic development, youth and families opportunities, which is education and small business development. This organization was founded about 30 years ago, and we understood that housing, you know, even though was the base of anything that we do, wasn't enough. Therefore, you know, we started developing different programs and different strategies to help our families succeed and move ahead and really get a foothold into the economy of the United States so they could be prepared to move forward. We have invested millions and millions of dollars, as well as hours and staff time, to really prepare our kids as well as our families that we serve to move forward through our Youth and Family Services Department. In addition to doing that, we also understand that access to capital, access to mortgage lending, access to small personal lending needs to be better designed for the communities that we serve. So we provide mortgage, pre-purchase and default prevention, counseling and education, mortgage lending, small lending for personal loans up to $5,000. And of course, you know, we can help you with other services such as, you know, financial capabilities, financial fitness, and that sort of thing. This is a very fundamental program that we offer for our communities to continue moving forward and acquiring assets, which is one of the most significant pieces of what we do for our community. The other piece is that education or employment is not necessarily for everyone. So we want to offer, and we've been offering this for about 6 years now, small business development. And in the same way that we do what we do, offering technical assistance, access to capital, a place that we call the Portland Mercado as a market, we offer all of these host of services for our communities to start their enterprises and again continue to get a foothold into the economy of the United States. But I want to talk to you a little bit more about this. So currently we serve over 1,500 residents that live in our properties. This image that you see on the upper left is going to be our latest development, which will be breaking ground on February 12th. It's a little behind, was supposed to be breaking ground in January, and it's going to be 142 units of affordable housing. One of the questions that the team asked about, some of these projects in terms of energy efficiency, public health, disaster preparedness, and so on and so forth, were really complex questions to answer in the next 5 to 10 minutes. But I can tell you that we've been thinking about this in a very systematic way from day one since we started designing these buildings. One of the things that are going to change and will continue to change with COVID-19, COVID-19 didn't come to stay. However, it came to make some significant changes. Steve mentioned something about reducing by so many millions of pounds of commuting time in terms of carbon and miles for all of these employees and workers that are working remotely from their homes. That is one of the considerations that we're taking into account right now, because we know that even our own organization is going to become a hybrid model in terms of working from home and working in the office. But for that, designers, architects, planners will have to rethink not only the web and the grid, to deliver power and to deliver internet services, but also to deliver a home that is very equipped to separate those uses of being at home and being in the office at the same time. It is not easy to be at home and have to work with your own kids and have to work in the same place that you are living in all the time. Therefore, we have to start thinking about those significant differences in terms of affordable housing or not affordable housing. Those design changes came to stay and they will continue to evolve over time. Another question that came to our table was, how is COVID-19 affecting these large developments? Well, it is affecting in a very significant way. One of the things that we didn't take into consideration is a pandemic. Obviously, we didn't know it was coming. We didn't know what kind of pandemic was going to be here with us. And certainly we were not thinking on a pandemic that was airborne. And therefore, these confined hallways in large buildings, whether it's affordable housing or not, present a challenge for us to develop better technologies and better efficiencies for these technologies to circulate air into our buildings in a more efficient fashion. All of that will cost money and obviously energy. So that this is posing even a greater challenge for engineers to come up with systems that are even more efficient in terms of energy efficiency. But more than that, we have to start thinking about the differences between energy efficiency and public health and indoor health in our buildings. It is a really delicate balance between reducing VOCs, particle matters, and keeping that thermal comfort that is so fundamental for the well-being of many, many individuals, especially the elderly and our little kids. I remember when I was doing some of my research at Arizona State University, one of the families that we found in a very poor neighborhood was one of the most efficient families in terms of energy use per square foot. So I decided to really go there and start, asking questions. I knew this because we did an entire, survey as to what houses were using for energy usage in terms of kilowatts per year. And this house was right on the bottom. So I didn't get it, an older neighborhood, an older house, an older this and that, and they were so efficient. I came to their house and the house was in actually really bad shape. but they were saving energy by unplugging most of the devices when they were working, by not turning on lights, by not using their cooling system, which was a storm cooler, not even a HVAC unit. That kind of sacrifice that people need to make in order to save energy, to be efficient, for economic reasons or environmental reasons, is not a reasonable expectation that we need to have from our communities. And sadly, most of these choices are made by people that have less resources than many of us do. So we have to think as to what is the future of housing in terms of really atomizing and utilizing the technology that Steve was talking about, while also thinking about some of the resources and safety net that comes with the studies that the City of Portland and Jonah's department is working on. We have to bring that technology to make homes a lot more smart. We have these little Nest thermostats where they are the closest that we can think of for highly accessible smart systems for our homes. They know when we're home, they understand, where our settings are, but really, that is really bottom of the line technology when it comes to real automatic homes that sense, dust, sense VOCs, and so on and so forth. Many of the furniture that we do releases VOCs, whether it's formaldehyde, which is not used that much anymore, but it was used in the past, so it exists in many homes today. That has to be removed in every way that we can. But today at Hacienda CDC, we're trying to develop healthy homes as one of the premises, as one of the most significant principles. Homes that are not only efficient in terms of energy usage, but are healthy for the people that are using them. That intersection between the human factor, utilizing lighting to create healthier environments, utilizing thermal comfort to bring that sweet point, for people to be comfortable, but not too comfortable so they can keep moving, and really reducing the amount of energy that everybody tends to use when they have so many and so many more devices, whether it's a cell phone, a cooling unit, a new TV, et cetera, et cetera. I want to end by saying that the homes that we're trying to develop, healthy homes, energy efficient homes, all of them boil down to one single bigger principle. And that is the idea of creating environments that are healthier, but more than that, just in terms of environmental justice, social justice, and economic justice for everyone, but especially for those communities that are the most underserved especially in cities as expensive as the city of Portland. I'm going to leave it there, but I want to just remind everyone that the homes that we're trying to achieve and to develop here are homes that will be have less VOCs indoors. They will be better ventilated. This COVID-19 situation is helping us to rethink the way we think of those ventilation systems. Lighting will be a very, very significant component of everything that we do. It's totally underrated, especially for housing, and needs to come back so we can create environments where kids can thrive, study, do their homework, and sleep well. Whenever the time of the day that is, they can be as comfortable as they can be. Diana, I'm going to pass it back to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know I had only a few minutes to speak. So that's all I got for you, and I am ready for questions in case we want to go there.
Thank you so much, Ernesto, and thank you for all your great work that you're doing at Hacienda. I look forward to the development breaking ground to celebrate with you. Our next speaker panelist is Vivek Chandras. He's a professor of climate adaptation and director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at Portland State University. Professor Chandras studies the effects of urban development patterns and processes of ecosystems and social justice. By examining the assumptions about our built environment, Professor Chandras aims to involve public institutions and historically marginalized communities in improving adaptation strategies from climate-induced stressors such as urban heat, air quality, and pluvial flooding. Welcome, Professor Chandras.
Hello, I hope you can hear me okay. I'll assume yes. Thanks for that, Ernesto. That was really inspiring, really grounding us in the lived experience of people and the technological systems that are constantly intersecting our lives. And Jana, of course, great to connect with you again around questions of emergency management and what is being done at the regional level, and recognizing that in many ways, we are really trying to uplift our own ability to prepare for some of these disasters. I'd like to just start off by just acknowledging Steve and the Bald Futurist in terms of setting up a stage of the role that technology plays in our lives. And I have a few slides. I don't want to lean on them too much, but I want this to be more of a provocative discussion than necessarily any specific answers or approaches that I can provide, but really to provoke your thinking around this particular topic of technology, of human health and well-being, and trying to understand the intersection of the role that past policies and past systems and our current existing systems play in potentially amplifying some of the inequities that we have seen bear all too clearly through the pandemic that we're all experiencing now. I want to just start though with, before getting into that, with this idea. I've been in this technology field in terms of trying to build sensors that are helpful for addressing local effects of climate change. So part of what our work, as some of you may be well aware of, is really to engage communities at one level, address local effects of climate change at another level, and then use these sensor systems, these engineered sensor systems, to understand air quality, temperature and humidity, and increasingly understanding issues of potential fire volatility and flooding, pluvial flooding. And so as we get into that a bit more, I just wanted to kind of couch this in the fact that we have an emergence of a smart city system that's really part of the broader discussion that Steve really teed up for us. And that is not a trivial transformation that's happening across cities in the world. Japan is pouring billions of dollars or yen into creating smart city systems. India is doing this similar approach. China, of course, Korea has been doing this for quite some time. South Korea has been doing this for quite some time. And of course, North America, Western Europe is well into this as well. So technology in and of itself is something that's becoming, again, broadly defined, something that's become very commonplace. And we've been able to take a modest dimension of that in terms of this sensing system and engage communities around it. So I've had to reflect a fair bit on what does it mean to engage in technology for understanding local effects of climate change. And my reflections have really got me provoked in terms of thinking about what this might mean for how we deploy some of these technologies. The fact that we have electric planes and really multi-dimensional, at least multi-mobile approaches to addressing post-Cascadia events are all incredibly compelling for me. And I also want to contextualize that within a broader set of systems within which this technology is likely going to be deployed. And so with this experience that we've had, we've also taken the sensor system and created a series of machine learning algorithms. And Steve was referring to this notion of AI in using some of this. So through these campaigns, we collect hundreds of thousands of data points in a region. And we have to use the most recent developments of artificial intelligence to create, to essentially understand what's happening in a place from a temperature and humidity point of view. And what we end up with is a series of maps that emerge as a result. So communities around, this year we engaged to 15 communities around the country in these campaigns, whether it be Rhode Island or Miami or Houston or San Jose or Seattle. We've kind of got this sensor technology out there, and I have to be upfront with folks about what the sensors are, what they do. And it turns out to be an enormous campaign event that attracts a lot of local media attention. And it's been really pretty interesting to watch this play out. And so at least in this forum, I have an opportunity to reflect on this from the technological point of view in terms of the environmental implications of applying some of these technologies. What we have done as a result of these campaigns is we create a series of maps using this artificial intelligence. And as some of you may have seen, we've seen these maps play out. We do this in the morning, afternoon, and evening, collecting hundreds of thousands of temperature humidity readings. And we can see in the town of Portland, where I live now, these systems produce specific maps. And as a result of these maps, and kind of at the core of this work, and what's really motivating much of this work, is the implication of what we're seeing emerge. And some very consistent pattern that we've noticed across the country is that places that tend to be hotter, which are the red colors here, and cooler in the blue colors, tend to have people who have generally less formal education, limited English proficiency, higher levels of racial diversity in the neighborhood, extreme levels of poverty, and less access to air conditioning and heat refuges. And this has been something that we're now documenting not only here in the Pacific Northwest, throughout the country. And it's an interesting pattern that we've been observing for many years now. And so recently, we wanted to do this more systematically and look to see if anything in the past has been helping us understand why we might be seeing these patterns. Often we are seeing these patterns, and I've heard both academics as well as practitioners and others alike say, well, this is a matter of a luxury effect phenomenon, where people who have more wealth are able to safeguard themselves by planting trees, by being more informed, etc. And there was something deeply unsatisfactory about that explanation of why we were seeing these patterns. So it really behooved us to start a project that looked at 108 cities across the country and explored why we were seeing these particular environmental stressors distributed in the way they are. And when we used a series of maps that were produced, where maps created back in the 1930s, these what were historically called redlining maps. And redlining was a process, as many of you may know, that started in the 1930s and furthered a process that had been there a century prior, that had codified at a national level specific neighborhoods. So these neighborhoods were considered A, B, C, and D, A being, quote, the best neighborhoods, and D being, quote, hazardous neighborhoods. And what we were seeing in looking at just surface temperature of these A, B, C, and D neighborhoods in 108 cities is that temperatures were consistently hotter in neighborhoods that were in the 1930s demarcated as, quote, hazardous neighborhoods. And what we subsequently noticed is that there's a greater amount of asphalt in those neighborhoods. A lot of the highway projects of the 1950s motored their way right through a lot of these C and D neighborhoods. There were large-scale housing projects that were pushed forward by federal funds, and those ended up in these C and D neighborhoods. And industrial facilities alike also ended up adjacent to some of these residential neighborhoods. And we also found, interestingly, a lack of green space in these neighborhoods. So this was something that is, again, something that was set up in a system from 1930s that has made its way to observing present day temperatures, where we're seeing much hotter lived experiences of communities in these neighborhoods than what we had seen in the past. And so that really, for us, really was much more satisfactory in knowing, or a lot of more satisfaction in knowing that this is not something that just is happening through individual behavior, though a systemic plague that had really captured a lot of planning agencies that allowed for this demarcation of neighborhoods that then led to current day intense heat experiences and running your air conditioner harder, having to do a lot more to reduce the potential impacts of heat, which kill more people per capita and annually than all other natural hazards, the pandemic notwithstanding. So that really gave us a little perspective into what is going on here with a system that has been so incredibly pernicious in its distributive outcomes and in its inequitable outcomes as a result. And in some ways, the cities that ranked at the top of our list, for example, we compared the A neighborhoods with the D neighborhoods and found that Portland, for me, a complete surprise in some ways, because I had been living here and doing this study and not expecting this result. I would have thought that Baltimore and St. Louis and a lot of cities that had very explicit and very vocal redlining conversations, that they would have been more at the top of the list. But Portland ended up at the top, Denver second, Minneapolis third, etc. And this was a moment of reckoning for me in noting that Oregon has a long history of incredibly very inequitable, very racist embedded policies that have potentially led to some of these outcomes that we're observing today. And so whether we're looking at Portland or whether we're looking at Denver or whether we're looking across the nation, these patterns, whether it be land surface temperature, which is the set of graphs on the left here, or tree canopy, which is a set of graphs on the right here, we're seeing that land surface temperature is consistently higher in any part of the US in these red line neighborhoods than we saw in the A neighborhoods. Same with tree canopy, much less tree canopy in the red line neighborhoods as opposed to the green line neighborhoods in these places. So what does this have to do with technology? What does this have to do with environmental intersection with some of those questions? Before we get to that question, I want to just present another analysis that a group of students in one of my classes did earlier this year, where they took the same A, B, C, D neighborhoods and looked at the top 10 industrial polluters around the Portland metro region. And the results were, in some ways, based on our previous study, not entirely surprising, because we were able to document that in at least this case, that 38% of people of color in Portland are living within 2 kilometers of the top 10 industrial polluters. Now, these are massive amounts of pollution that are coming out the pipes. And just to note that that is something that is a residual or a legacy of past planning practices, which we'll come back to. And 42% of all C and D red line grades are within 1 kilometer of top 10 facilities. And then 35% of total emissions in Portland are produced by these top 10 industrial polluters. So that's one metro region. And if we were to take this and apply it, same analysis to many other cities, I wouldn't be surprised based on our previous study if we would find similar results. So I wanted to kind of just close this particular piece out with a last set of graphs that show at least cities on the West Coast and what's happened more recently from 1980 to 2016 in terms of the A, B, C, and D neighborhoods. And this is just population growth in these different neighborhoods. And what we see as a pattern here is the C and D neighborhoods are consistently the places where the largest number of people and the greatest amount of population growth has been occurring. And we're referring to this as kind of this notion of permissive spaces, that when a large-scale housing complex goes in, the A and B neighborhoods, who have been, again, historically very connected to decision-making systems, are often the ones who are saying, not in my backyard. And it ends up going, like the big box stores or like the industrial polluters or freeways in generations past, into these C and D neighborhoods, which create a further level of inequity that emerges as a result. And so as we think about this more current day impact of population growth, it creates what we're referring to also as a green squeeze, in which any kind of option for managing those spaces for greenery, for parks, and for anything that might cool those neighborhoods becomes increasingly challenged with this growth of population and then resulting infrastructure in those places. I want to kind of back up from this and say, what does this have to do with technology? And if we're talking about technology as a kind of agnostic application where it doesn't have particular biases, I want to just really check that right now and just spend the last couple of minutes of my time recognizing that there are some really pernicious historical systems that have not changed a great deal over the past century, and that we are in many ways working in exactly the same system that generated these inequities to begin with, because the residential segregation has led to resource distribution, led to a certain level of landscape heterogeneity. And this paper that came out earlier this year kind of punctuated this study that we generated earlier. And what this really got us thinking about was how these systemic biases applied to a landscape might really show up in terms of what people experience in terms of pollution, in terms of heat, in terms of flooding, and that this whole conversation about conservation is running parallel to conservation about civil rights and justice and equity that has been long connected to power and opportunity, resources, and wealth. And that's where, for me, this whole technology piece comes around full circle, because those folks who do have access to power, opportunity, resource, and wealth are in many ways able to determine how these specific technologies are deployed. And the amount of capital that we're talking about with some of the companies that are embedded in these technological developments are in and of themselves, we have understood, deeply biased in terms of the way that technologies are deployed or used. And I just would want to close out with recognizing that one of my recent favorite books that I've been reading is Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin, who's out of Princeton, and has been really provoking me to think about how we deploy our sensor systems in cities and how we center that work with the communities that have in many ways faced the hardest burden of the planning decisions that have been made in the past and the environmental impacts, as well as the emerging climate impacts that are go hand in hand with some of these past decisions. And Ruha Benjamin really helps me get a few fundamental concepts, including the following, which are, at least for me to get a better understanding, is this notion of technological benevolence, in that what we're essentially in many ways assuming is that the technologies coming forward are really helpful for humanity, are really going to be deployed in just, equitable ways, and that they fix, repair, get even with, make stable, or influence actions or outcomes. And that can be really a challenging proposition when we're thinking about how technology has been deployed in the past. Another issue that comes up really is this idea of design. And before I get into that, though, I have a previous point that I want to make, is the idea of predictive practices, the rise of AI. And we've seen massive, I've been working in this AI field, and I know the algorithms and how they're really structured, and I've gotten to know them much better over the last decade. And one of the things that I've seen emerge simultaneously is using AI to do electronic monitoring of things, to do predictive policing, facial recognition, and the biases, the systemic biases that are embedded within these predictive practices can really create a further deepening of inequities that we have already in society. And so the question of, are designers still mainly occupied with designs that make people want things, is a question I would want to pose to Steve and others who are in this field far more deeply than I am. And I would really want to kind of think about this as from a point of, is it about selling more things to more people, or is it really about trying to understand and recenter some of the historic inequities that have been in place and that we need to get a better understanding of? And finally, a couple of last points is, who owns these data that are being generated? We know from recent impacts from Facebook manipulating 2016 elections that the ownership of data is has pretty serious implications on children being separated from their parents. In other words, from policies that are then promulgated by people who are then owners of those data, or at least have access to some ways of being able to use the data for specific influencing of outcomes. And so that becomes another massive area of curiosity for me as to how we think about, finally, the role of municipal institutions in being able to mediate some of these pernicious issues that come up in terms of predictive practices, designs, as well as ownership and the benevolence questions that are underlying a lot of these emerging technologies. And I'm likely not the first person to be having this conversation with Steve and all of you. So I'd be really curious to see how we can have a conversation that deepens this, deepens the bigger questions that are at play right now in terms of who has access and how we might actually address some of these systemic biases that have been entrenched and deeply embedded in our systems of decision making. So let me pause there and open it up and turn it back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Vivek. I really appreciate it. I can't share my screen, so I will just be a voice. We are at time, so I really want to thank our panelists, and if they can stay on just a few minutes longer, we would love to answer some of the questions that have been posed by some of our audience members. So I would love Jana Castellum, our Deputy Director for Programs, to jump on and field some of these questions for us.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And thank you to all of the presenters. That was really outstanding and very interesting to see how those different threads of thought came together. I'm gonna go ahead and jump into a few questions. The first, I'll start with you, Vivek, because I think there's some really interesting parallels between what Steve was talking about and what you were touching on the end. I'm really interested in your work and how you've really kind of democratized access to data, and you're using it to ask some really interesting questions, but you're also building community with technology too, in I think a kind of interesting and unique way. And I wonder if you could just sort of expand upon that a little bit, and how community has come together, especially in an era where maybe there's a mistrust of science.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. Just three things on that, and I'll be brief about this because I know we're time limited here. But first is we're not going to any community we're not invited into. Like, that's rule number one. I'm not trying to bring this to a community. We essentially are doing this work. We publish with it. We engage with media outlets, and if it's of interest to a community to want to have a conversation, we engage with them and kind of deepen that conversation. So that's a big part of this, is really kind of starting from a place of community owning this and wanting to drive it on their own. And that is, I think, a big pillar for our work. And the other two are essentially that, we essentially have a process by which we want to work with community-based organizations that focus on social, environmental, and climate justice questions. And so whether those organizations are organizations that work specifically on environmental issues or climate issues is not of interest to us. We want to really center the communities that have not been able to participate in a lot of the conversations around decision making that is in many ways befallen them, and the reasons by which they are now experiencing some of the worst pollution, as well as some of the worst heat effects that are occurring. So we really want to that's a big part of it, and we remunerate as part of this. We find ways through philanthropy and other approaches to remunerate the participants in these that work with us in these campaigns. And then finally, we do a ton of interpretation, local community-based interpretation, where we can generate the maps. We talk about our process. We're transparent. All the stuff is open source. And we put it forward in such a way where the communities can actually interpret, understand, and in many ways improve the approach that we're taking. And so we kind of go back and ask the question of, okay, does this, are these results consistent with your lived experience of place? Because that is really what we're ultimately trying to support and kind of advance, is improving your lived experience of place and addressing the needs of what you have before us talking about climate or other environmental issues that may be on our agenda. Being able to really recognize that this is something that we want to begin with the community need and the community place. And that adds a level of civic legitimacy that we've found with this work. And it really allows then planners and others to have, I think, informed conversations with community groups about how best to manage what's happening in a specific neighborhood. And so those are at least quick responses to your very profound question.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. We're really excited to have you in our community and follow what you continue to do in the future. Steve, I'm going to jump over to you. There are a couple of questions that came in asking about how kind of advances in satellite technology can have both some maybe challenges. We have a bunch of stuff flying around us, but also how do we also use this to serve maybe some more of our far-flung communities, including rural areas where folks maybe don't have access to broadband at this point. So I'm wondering if you can touch on a little bit of that rural piece and the equity that comes with that as well.
Yeah, I think in the digital world and digital economy that we all live in, one of the best things we can do to help rural areas develop is to make sure that we democratize broadband. So if we live in a city, then you're going to get, glorious, you're going to be bathed in beautiful 5G connectivity, which will be super fast, 10 to 100 times faster than what we have today with 4G technology. But if you're in rural environment, you're kind of out of luck, and that's not good enough. So that's why I'm really excited about these satellite networks that will bring high-speed connectivity equivalent to think of it as like 4.5G. So halfway between 4G and 5G technology. And once we get gateways built, a gateway takes you from one technology to another that takes in satellite and then sprays out 4G or sprays out Wi-Fi in a building, then you can start to really connect people you have one satellite dish for a whole community. That is going to help us connect the next 4 billion minds to the internet to help to bank the unbanked, to connect people with economic opportunity that they couldn't have before. So I think it's a very important and powerful technology. It's much overlooked by technologists like me who talk about this kind of stuff. So that's my tip for one of the ones to really watch. In terms of the risks, yeah, there are risks. Astronomers are already a bit pissed off about this because there's little reflective things now polluting their view of the skies. And the real big downside risk, which is a low risk but still worth talking about, is that if these satellites, because there's so many of them, collide, and then you get debris, and that debris collides with other satellites, you could cause a chain reaction that makes our skies a real mess. That is a well understood problem. And so there's a lot of technology wrapped around these satellites to avoid that. They all fly at different heights. They have different flight paths, so they should be fine. Space turns out is a big place. So you can have these tiny satellites, which are about the size of a mini fridge. They're not very big. Avoid each other fairly effectively. But that's the downside risk. A little bit of astronomy impact, but huge upside in terms of connecting people to each other and to economic opportunity.
Thank you. Jana, there were such a fascinating presentation and pulling together some interesting, trends in the way people think about things. How much are we future-proofing the way we think? And then what are we doing to actually get prepared? I'm going to combine two questions. One is, how are you thinking about future-proofing some of the projects you're thinking about, bringing in earthquake resiliency to some of the solar projects? And then you had a really interesting phrase about social cohesion, creating better resiliency. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, just paint a little bit of a picture about communities with social cohesion, with good social cohesion. What does that look like? What are some of those attributes? And how do we build on that?
Well, thank you for that. So starting with the first part of the question about sort of building sort of future-proofing or disaster-proofing projects, I think that that takes a couple of forms. One, I would just say that our current building codes are very practically, they're designed for collapse prevention, to prevent people from being killed in the incident of a disaster like an earthquake, but they leave the building to be pretty disposable. So it's not an assumption that would be repaired afterwards. And so just building the current code might protect the lives of people inside, but it doesn't do anything for that sort of post future. And so our bureau and the city and others have been advocates for strengthening building codes to set the standard a bit higher, so that in future buildings we can expect they'll be repaired and play a role in recovery and not kind of get thrown away. So that's one way. And although building codes don't hold us to that standard, certainly in designing its own projects, the building that I work in, or the fire station, or the community center project I'm talking about, we are building to this higher standard that we anticipate would be not no impacts of an earthquake, not immediate occupancy, but something that is repairable and reusable in the future. So that's kind of how we're approaching that. And then in terms of social cohesion, let's see. So there's there's a whole literature and academic research around that, and some metrics that we might look at to measure social cohesion would be things like checking out books at the library, people that are registered to vote, the number of people who can give, the number of people who can name, 3 neighbors on their block. Like, those are all kind of ways that we might measure social cohesion, or we might think about our own neighborhood, how strong that is. In terms of how that looks in the work that my bureau does, I didn't talk a lot about our volunteer programs, but the city of Portland actually has the largest volunteer program for neighborhood emergency response teams in the United States. We have more than 2,200 active members that have completed 30 hours of training, attend monthly meetings, and do at least 12 hours of service a year. And those groups are organized into neighborhoods, and they meet, virtually recently, but more previously in person. And so that's a way that we're sort of trying to build that social cohesion of neighbors knowing neighbors and being engaged with thinking about the future, and sort of proactively making plans to help one another in the future, but practically also helping one another in the day-to-day. And a lot of our work right now is focused on how we can broaden those networks that include our volunteers to also include other folks who perhaps don't have the interest or resources to donate so much time and be so engaged with municipal government, but who would still like to be part of of a neighborhood network of people that care about each other and are committed to help one another when they face emergencies, big or small.
Thank you so much. Ernesto, we're going to give you the last question. Your project work is so interesting in the way it really brings together, I think, sort of best practices in science and building design, but also in building community. And I was wondering, you know, are your buildings and your projects teachers in and of themselves? Do you use your spaces for more education about kind of sustainability and opportunity? And then because 2020 has been such a strange and hard year, I wonder if you might also give us your last thoughts on sort of like what gives you hope for the year ahead, and we'll go out on a high note. Oh, let's get your sound turned back on.
Got it back on. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Jana, and everybody else. So yes, we are trying since my arrival to design buildings with a purpose, as we call it. You know, these buildings don't have to be just structures that are warehousing people just for the sake of warehousing them. We're trying to design, and we have designed everything that we do from our sidewalks all the way through the building itself. For examples, here in our headquarters, you know, they were placing 35 kilowatts of PV on the rooftop, and we did. But an array of that, I decided to place it right against in a very visible portion of the parking lot. The reason I did that is not because we didn't have a space on the rooftop. It's because we needed to make an example that this building was being powered by solar and not necessarily just because it was sitting on the rooftop. It is important for us to spread those ideas in a way that they are very visible for the community to see them. We also have monitors and, you know, little kiosks for information that are very common, you know, in many places. Our sidewalks, for example, are interactive sidewalks. We don't want a sidewalk to be just a little path made of concrete. We want those sidewalks to have little phrases that tell you a little bit about history of that place, that tell you about, you know, a riddle or a question that you may want to ask, or force these kids to play a game right as they are walking, when they are going to school or when they are coming from school, or when they are in the parking lot or the playground. Our buildings also need to make a statement. One of the reasons that I believe in color as a statement for progress and difference is because most of the time, you know, we tend to design with the lowest design idea, simplistic idea, and colors, and not really making a statement of who we are, what we do. So we need to express our personalities and the communities that we are trying to represent in a larger scale through that color, through that design. So those buildings by themselves are speaking already on who we are, where we're coming from, and what kind of, you know, community we want to see moving forward. In addition to that, you know, we are trying to bring community together by finding what I call the heart of the community in Cali. And we are envisioning the new master plan for the entire Hacienda campus, which will have almost 500 homes right here in the Northeast, not to, you know, without removing all the houses that we have beyond Northeast. And we're trying to find this little plaza that will sort of represent the plazas in Mesoamerican communities, as well as European and Latino communities, where people used to gather, came together for us to build that community and find that space to really socialize at the community level. All of these buildings with a purpose, as we are calling them, are an experiment that is really not so much of an experiment, you know, elsewhere, especially in Latin America. These buildings are simply borrowing information, lessons of what we saw, and we have seen that works. So what gives me hope, you know, for the future, what gives me hope for 2021 is that this pandemic has taught us a number of things. I recently published a little article in Forbes magazine. I can send you the link shortly. But things are changing. But everything that happened today and during this year has changed our mindsets in a way that has humanized all of us and help us develop trust beyond what I thought it was possible. Who cares about systems or coming to the office every single day? We know what we need to get done. We know that this is something that is, you know, just a bump on the road, but it's making us a lot stronger. Once this pandemic is over, this is going to be better than anything else that you can think of in terms of policy developments or new breakthroughs in terms of technology. That trust that we're developing between our teams and our families and our community are going to stay here for a very, very long time. And that, my friend, is going to be what it's going to make us stronger for a better future. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. That is a great message to end on. I really want to thank our panelists and our keynote speakers, Steve Brown, Jana, Ernesto, and Vivek, for sharing your experience and expertise with us here today. Just one last thank you to all those who joined us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. We'd love to answer what we can and share them to our panelists. And again, thanking all our sponsors who made today possible. This information will help hopefully spark conversations in our work and our communities that not only will impact our immediate future, but really build back better for the next 5, 10, and beyond years. So thank you again so much. We hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.